Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Sarah tōku ingoa. This session today is about cognitive load theory. And so, yeah, we're just flowing on from last session on memory and um, recall. So, just a wee karakia before we get started. Te hui whaia te mā tauranga kia marama, kia whaitaki ngā mahi katoa, tū maia, tū kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou katoa. Just a wee overview. Cognitive load theory was developed by John Sweller in the 1980s. So it's a it's established theory in education literature, and it really explains how just the human brain processes and stores information. So we built on that last week, and I'll go over it again on the two types of memory, and then how we retrieve that memory. Um, yeah, so basically, because your memory has a limited capacity. So learning is most effective when instructional design. So when we design our lessons with respect to that memory, to not and knowing that memory. And ultimately, working memory can only hold up to from 5 to 9 pieces of information at a time, and obviously depends on how new that information is to a learner. So when too much is presented simultaneously, it's called cognitive overload, where there's too much basically, and it impairs the learning process and decision making because the concepts don't connect or build on the other. So effective teaching is just really about managing the amount and complexity of the information that we give to students. Why is that important in biology? Because it's extremely difficult sometimes, because conceptually the topic is complex, the subject, sorry, is complex, especially things like homeostasis, where it can be very difficult for students to grasp. And also if there's no prior knowledge or, little prior knowledge beginning with it. So how does that information, like going back to this diagram from last week, or last session, sorry, about the information processing model, whereby we get in sensory information in our brain, and then it goes into our working memory when we start using it. It gets forgotten unless it's repeated. And then it becomes, once we repeat it and rehearse it, that working memory then can encode it into our long-term memory, which is the important part, which is why we might have exposure to something if it hasn't then been moved into our working memory, i.e., we haven't established some kind of learning around it, or then we haven't rehearsed that information, it doesn't go into our long-term memory, and therefore it cannot be retrieved. So a student actually couldn't retrieve information that, even though they've seen it 5 times, while we teachers talk about it, you've seen it 5 times. I remember saying it to my students many times. They can't, I have to challenge myself with this, but they can't retrieve something that they didn't encode. And so really getting this process, this flow of information and learning correct is important for our students to really establish a learning procedure. And some of them will be more independent with this than others. So two types of cognitive load. So breaking it into the cognitive load aspect, so looking at the brain itself, there's intrinsic load, which is the inherent complexity of the learning material. So when we give them new topics, a student might be intrigued because they haven't seen it before and they're learning it for the first time. So it's an intrinsic thing because they're learning it. And there may or may not be more of that, depending on, as we know, the amount of prior knowledge that's there. The extraneous load is the other type of cognitive load, is essentially the mental effort around it. So if you present too much information that's unnecessary, or there's distractions in the classroom, there's instructional design aspects that are poor, confusing layout, anything those are called extraneous loads. So it's not simple for people to, or for a student to understand. I'll give you an example of this. So here's, just ignore this third type of cognitive load. I'll speak to that in a minute. But basically, here's our intrinsic load, and that's that learning process. So I like how they did it in the frontal lobe. Anyway, basically you've got your intrinsic load and the task difficulty and the complexity, and the student's working right? The extraneous load is in the red here, and these are things like the digital distractions, their phones in the classroom. This is their peers that are making too much noise, distracting everybody. And I mean distracting. Like you can have peer interactions that actually contribute to intrinsic load, but distractions are not necessarily interactions that help. So distractions could be someone else misbehaving or the like. It could also be a poorly designed educational app or a poorly designed slideshow or whatever. That's just stuff that the student has to work hard in their brain to think about, but it actually doesn't contribute to their learning process. So simplify all of it. So essentially, if we can do this, we can get to effective working memory capacity by not having too much extraneous load, and then obviously exposing the intrinsic load and kind of presenting a little bit ahead of what the students have already learned. So it has to be ahead, it has to progress them, it has to make them think about something, intrigue them, or connect a new idea or the like. Essentially, this germane load, I would just add, this was the third type of cognitive load in the past. It's now been combined into intrinsic load, and the two are basically essentially one now, rather than being separated. And that's more recent in the literature. So, some suggestions of how we might do this. So, we might start with pre-teaching, um, or, yeah, start with pre-teaching, segmentation, the learning, sequence, and vary that sequence. So, we might add something to it or give a variation of a practical. And then we might give it to the students to do something, i.e., expertise reversal, which means that they have to then, display their knowledge of it. So there's a bit of a flow there. I've sort of already talked about this 2 weeks ago. But some suggestions for doing this. So breaking up your unit into smaller manageable units. So if you've got a really low level class, as I already mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago, we might break up a lesson that is quite, for an accelerated class. They might have larger units of chunks. But for a low level class, you might need to break it up even further. So you need to think about your learners in your room and then obviously consider what's going to be their intrinsic load and then progress them through it. Remove unnecessary or repeated information from your material. So don't repeat yourself too much, right? Some repetition is important, but different repetition. So make sure each time they're doing something new, it's different, slightly different, and allowing them to retrieve information or the like. So it's a purposeful design of materials. But combine visual diagrams with verbal explanations. So you have a combination of visuals and text on the same slide, and obviously try to bring in bullet points. I'm a big fan of bullet points because a bullet point should make your point quick, and those points are there. I don't know if I generally use big explanations on a slide, so we limit what kind of text we're doing for the learners in the room. And then do worked examples. So low-level kids will definitely need this, where they need worked examples or step-by-step demonstrations. So it's kind of like a lesson as a flow chart, and you're reducing that intrinsic load by going from one thing to the next, and you're breaking that complexity up even into smaller chunks. And then, oh yeah, I've already sort of mentioned this. So I've made a sort of a list of what general problems we tend to face that kind of add to that extraneous load. Busy slides, long paragraphs, busy slides and long paragraphs, clear visuals, easy fonts, pictures, bold. I often find it doesn't actually matter about the font that you're using, or doesn't matter as long as it, generally attracts the student to the materials. But it does matter how well they can read it. So if it's not big enough font, or if it's not, all these are very basic things, but they are extraneous load that the student's brain will be struggling to decode as they're learning. So making your materials very clear and concise and well considered in the way that you scaffold them is imperative. And as I've mentioned, with long paragraphs, change them all to bullet points and minimize your texts. Um, if students are learning how to write paragraphs, well, you do it with them. You model. I wouldn't necessarily put them on a slide. And the reason for me to do, unless you're breaking it up into chunks of paragraphing, and you could perhaps say, well, this part is the point of the sentence and this is the explanation. And then you can scaffold that learning in segments. Lots of simple images. And then if you've got key terms, especially if you've got like homeostasis, you might need to have a whole list of things like negative feedback. You might need to just have the students learn those terms prior to teaching them any content. Or I personally like to do it after I've done at least a lesson, and then I give the vocab at the end of the lesson. And I say, right, guys, these are the key terms. We've been over them today, and we've put them in context. And these key terms are now going to be taught throughout the lesson for the rest of the week. This is your homework. And we're going to be practicing them in class. So I would give them time to write them out as well. So if you've got lots of new terms, definitely break up those and then try and work on them progressively as you work through content. And then multiple sources of information. We'll keep it really clear with those explanations, keep them really succinct and explicit. So notice a few things about cognitive load is that there's sometimes this expertise reversal effect where you might have both of these in your classroom. You might have novices and you might have experienced learners. You might have some really, really top level kids and some low level kids, and that's fine. Just know that they're going to need different things for their cognitive load. One being that your low level kids probably need, or novices, we call them, they probably need a lot more guidance, a lot more structure, and a lot more worked examples to see how things are applied, how knowledge is applied in context. They also probably need a lot more of the why at times too. Whereas your experienced learners probably already know all of those things. So accelerating them, well, actually, there's been a study done around if you don't accelerate them, they actually get worse. It can be worse for their attention, for them remaining engaged in the lessons or future learning, because experienced learners need that independence, they need extension and application, so they need more worked examples. So you need to have that available for those kinds of students. So work out how you could accommodate varying degrees of expertise in your class. So just a wee lesson plan example of this, and this is how, I teach variations of this every time I teach osmosis, but the last 16 years, I have taught a general scenario of this. Now, sometimes I break this up over 2 lessons rather than having it over 1, and I'm going to talk about how I might do that. But for a starter or hey mahi, I might do something around what is passive transport. My students probably don't know a lot about it, but to engage their prior knowledge, I might talk about that. So I might either do a quiz, a think, pair, share, or just a simple question on the whiteboard where I get them to discuss with each other and then amongst themselves what passive transport is. And I might put 3 questions up if I'm doing it that, and I keep it at discussion level, and then I will build the concept. So after they've done that, say for 5 minutes or so, I will build on that concept. I will draw a diagram of the 2 solutions, and I might have one with separated by partially permeable, or both separated by partially permeable membrane, semi-permeable membrane. And then I might go through, this is the 2 solutions, and explain those solutions. I could even show it to them before I then do a practical with them. So I talk about the 2 solutions first, and then talk about the difference between a solute and a solvent. I might do some of those basic Year 9 concepts that they will have learned, and then bring that into this concept here, where I might then discuss the movement between cells. So this is where I might start talking about passive transport. Then I would give a definition, and just to give you an idea, I might give them this definition. I might include, depending on the level of the students, I might include the vocabulary that they might use, or I might not. Depends on how much scaffolding they need. But I have these slides as a backup that I then adapt. I also, alongside my definition, I will have a diagram, whether I have drawn it or whether that I have shown it, but I would definitely have a diagram. Um, and then I would highlight a few things when I'm giving that definition. So I would talk about how it's water moving because it's osmosis. I would highlight this and I would repeat it. And I would talk about how the membrane is required because these are important features of osmosis. I would then highlight it and I would also get my students to repeat it. So I would go over these 5 facts as a thing, or 4 facts, sorry, that I would then repeat. I would then talk about how it's passive and then how it moves down a concentration gradient. Because these are things that help the students understand it, it's important that they know them explicitly and that I teach them explicitly. I would then move into, once I know that they've grasped that, if I've repeated it enough times, they've grasped that concept enough, once they've copied down the notes, I obviously focus on understanding and then get them to copy down the note. And then I would move into visual modeling where I draw a diagram of the process. Now I would model it with my students. Now I might do them together or I might not. It depends on the learners in my room. And then I would then follow that with a scenario. Now you could easily use a SciPad for that scenario because there's enough in there. So I would give them the plant cell and salt water solution, or I'd do the red blood cell and distilled water solution. And we talk about I'd ask the students to predict where the water would move. So I get them to practice that together with the whole class and see if they can apply the knowledge that they've just conceptualized into the scenario. And then I would either, if I have enough time in the lesson, usually I'd have a guided practice task. So I'd usually have a short osmosis task available. Now, obviously, we're not going to have results for some of this because with osmosis, it takes some setting up beforehand. But if you're getting them to record weights before, you might use most of the lesson getting them to do that. I personally love the golden syrup, the egg and golden syrup, and then egg and water solution. You'd have to prepare that though. So just be wary that if you're doing that practical, you'd need to dissolve the shell around the egg and you need to leave it, I think, for at least 24 hours. I think sometimes it's 3 days. And it will actually dissolve the whole shell around the egg. And then you can place it in the golden syrup and water. And it's quite a cool experiment because the students get to see this egg that's real gloopy and yucky, but how much it shrinks when it's placed in golden syrup. So it's a really obvious situation. Weighing, however, becomes difficult. So you could have that prepped beforehand. I have done that as well, where I show them an example of one that I've prepped, or I then get them to do the raisin in water or do an example. Likely you'll be doing this experiment for the internal anyway, so you can't probably give what you're already going to give in the internal, so you'd probably want to find something that's alternative. But I find vegetables are pretty good. Cucumber, zucchini are very good. Carrots, very good. They tend to give good results. So yeah, getting them to practice doing this when they're ready is probably the next step. And then the last bit is the independent application, which is where you might give them a whole scenario of their own that they work on entirely. And you'd scaffold how they work on it, but they essentially work on it independently or in a group of two, perhaps, before then doing the assessment. So I would do all of that and as a process of learning osmosis. And then, so essentially, what do I come to? Summarizing everything today. So we want to design to reduce, usually, and then extend cognitive load, or intrinsic load specifically, for our students. So we need to chunk information into manageable units, avoid overwhelming our students, include as many visual hierarchies or concepts as visuals as possible. For biology, that's really important. And then just reduce that extraneous cognitive load. And then just, yeah, so we're balancing those two types of load in our lessons. And so we eliminate any redundant aspects of our lesson. So anything that's irrelevant or doesn't necessarily assist students with their understanding of their growth, of their learning, we remove it. So just this week's reading, I'm going to send out a couple of these, both of these. They're both readings. I actually recommend the second one, but both are quite good. And yeah, if you've got a chance to access a library, I would also recommend these two, but specifically this bottom one here, this one is called Cognitive Load Theory in Action, because it's really about teachers. But this one's a small handbook as well, and I think is quite good, but I do recommend that bottom one, Lovell. And then references from today. Just a wee whakatauki, mā te rongo, ka mōhio, mā te mōhio, ka mārama, mā te mārama, ka mātou, mā te mātou, ka ora. Thank you. Cheers, everybody.